This is 145th Street, a book of short stories by Walter Dean Myers. We're going to begin with Big Joe's Funeral on chapter 1, page 1. Please track the text. Here we go. Big Joe's Funeral. The way I see it, things happen on 145th Street that don't happen anywhere else in the world. I'm not saying that it's weird or anything like that, but it's like intense. So when I heard about Big Joe's funeral, it didn't take me by surprise. It was something that I remember. That's why I'm telling it. This is the way it went down. The funeral took place on the 4th of July, one of the hottest days of the year. People were sitting out on their fire escapes or on their front stoops trying to catch a breeze. If there was a breeze in the hood, it must have stopped somewhere else for an iced tea, because I didn't see it or feel it. Nobody was doing any unnecessary movements unless their name was Peaches Jones, who was setting out to ruin Big Joe's funeral. Peaches was what you would call seriously fine. She was 15, about 5'3", a medium brown color, and definitely wrong. She was wrong because she was not giving Big Joe his propers, which means his proper respect. A person ought to have respect for the other people all of the time, but especially at 2 times during their life. The first time is when they're born. When a baby is born, you shouldn't say discouraging things about it, like, hey, I see prettier dogs than your baby, or maybe he ain't ugly, maybe he's just inside out. Give the baby a chance. And the other time you need to know to show respect is when a person is going on out of this world. You know, like their dad and whatnot. Let the person go. Whatever will be their reward has got to be figured out on the other side. Even if they slip on out owing you some money, you gotta bite the bullet, give up some slack, and let them be on their way. But Peaches didn't see it that way when it came to Big Joe. She had her mind dead set on messing up Big Joe's funeral. Please pause the recording and answer questions 1 and 2. Let me back up here and tell you. It all started when Big Joe, who owns Big Joe's Barbecue and Burger Restaurant right here on 45th Street, down from the Easy On In Cafe, decided to cancel his life insurance. Said that he'd been paying on his life insurance for 20 years. If he canceled it, he would get a check from the insurance company for $18,000. Now that's some serious money. Sounded good when the guys in the barbershop were talking about it. So Big Joe canceled his insurance, and sure enough, 2 weeks later, he was telling everybody that the check came just like he thought it would. That's when he decided to have the funeral. I've always loved a good funeral, Big Joe said. He was sitting outside his restaurant peeling potatoes to make a potato salad. And when I went to Freddie's funeral, you'll remember Freddie. Yeah, I remember Freddie and his funeral, Willie Murphy said. He looked real good. That's my point, Big Joe said. He was looking better than I'd ever seen him. He was clean, had his hair combed, wore that dark suit with the carnation in his lapel. He was sharp, Willie went on, and when Angela, that little Puerto Rican girl, sang Precious Lord, everybody was crying. Ain't nobody was crying Freddie when he was alive, Big Joe said. Funerals bring out the best in people. Am I lying or flying? You definitely flying, I said. I hate to talk about the dead, Willie added, but when Freddie was a walkie-talkie, all he wanted to do was hang out on the corner and ask everybody he seen if they had any spare change so he could take it down to the Ease On In and get him a beer. Uh-huh, but he still had him a nice funeral, Big Joe said. I'm going to have me a nice funeral while I'm still alive, so I can appreciate it. Now, we didn't exactly know what Big Joe meant by that, but he started explaining, and it made sense. He was going to take part on that $18,000 and throw himself a funeral the way some people throw a party. Nothing too fancy, he said, just something nice. Oh, that's what he did. He went over to the Unity Funeral Home on Adam Clayton Powell Boulevard and arranged things with them. At first, old man Turner, who ran the place, was a little put out. He saw where live people having funerals would greatly increase his business, and he said, okay. He was going to supply the coffin, the hearse, which carried the coffin, and 2 limousines. The good part of this was that since I was there when Big Joe was first talking about his funeral, I was going to get to ride in one of the limousines. Big Joe asked Leroy Brown, who had a little band, to play the music at his funeral. And then he found Angela, that little girl who had sung at Freddie's funeral, and asked her to sing along. Now you're probably wondering what Sadie, Big Joe's girlfriend, thought about all this. Well, she didn't like it one bit. "You don't mess with dying," she said, her hands on her hips. "You go laying up in some coffin and death liable to reach out and snatch you right away from here." "Woman, you just superstitious," Big Joe said. "Ain't nothing to worry about." Sadie was a widow lady, her husband having been run over by an ambulance while he was on the way across Malcolm X Boulevard to buy a lotto ticket. Maybe her being a widow made her touchy, but if she was a little upset, it was nothing compared to what her daughter, Peaches, felt. When Peaches heard about Big Joe's plans, she was madder than a junkyard dog with fleas. Please pause and answer questions 3 and 4. "He's been asking my mama to marry him for last year," Peaches said. "He's gonna be a good husband. What's he gonna do around after he's dead?" "Is she gonna marry him?" I asked. "She doesn't need to marry him or anybody else," Peaches said. Big Joe had promised Sadie he was going to adopt Peaches once they were married. That looked like a good deal to me because Big Joe was really successful and everyone liked him. Not only that, but her brother was handsome too. He was tall and dark and had white hair at the temples, which made him distinguished looking. Peaches and her mama argued up one side of Big Joe and down the other, but he did not change his mind. He was going to have his funeral. Big Joe was popular on 145th Street. If you were a little down on your luck and needed a meal or a pair of shoes or even half a month's rent, you could go to Big Joe and he'd listen to you and more than likely help you out too. So by the day of the funeral, it looked like there was going to be a big turnout. Now, besides Sadie and Peaches, there were some sisters from the church who thought the idea was a little peculiar, and they made sure that everybody knew it. But even some of them showed up because they appreciated a good funeral too. Well, the 4th of July was hot, but the undertaker's parlor was air-conditioned. There were only 2 funerals scheduled for that day, Big Joe's in the afternoon and a funeral for someone named Calderon later that night. When we came into the funeral parlor, there was a Big Joe lying up in his casket. It spooked me out. Big Joe wasn't moving a muscle, and you could see he had on some of that makeup they put on dead people. Sadie sitting in the front row with her arms folded and her jaws tight. Please pause and answer questions 5 and 6. When it was my turn to file past the coffin, I did so real slow. I knew that Big Joe was alive, but I didn't know what I would do if he suddenly sat up. I was glad to sit back down again. The funeral director's wife played some songs on the organ, and then Angela sang her heart out, and there were real tears running down her face. Then some of Joe's friends stood up and said all good things about him. Leroy's band, the All-Star Stompers, played Amazing Grace and One More River to Cross, and before you knew it, we were deep into the funeral. I looked over at Sadie, and she was getting a little misty, too. When the inside part of the funeral was over, the undertaker shut the coffin. I watched to see if Big Joe was going to move. The dude didn't even twitch. When we got outside, the hearse and the limousines were waiting, and so was Peaches. She and 2 of her friends, Latoya and Squeezy, had painted this big sign that read, "Big Joe is not dead." Mother Fletcher, who might be the oldest woman on the block, was just passing by and saw them. She went over to them. I went over too. I wanted to know what she was going to say. "You're right, child," Miss Fletcher said. "The flesh fades, but the spirit lives on in the eternal reward." "That's not what I mean," Peaches said. "I mean, he's really not dead." "Suffer the little children," Mother Fletcher said as she started walking away. "Glory, hallelujah." Peaches and her crew held up their signs across the street, and people on the block looked at them and looked at the funeral, and most of them didn't know exactly what was going on. Chops Peterson came over to me and said, "Peaches should mind her own business." "If Big Joe is supposed to be her daddy someday, maybe it is her business," I said. "Well, he's not her daddy yet," Chops said. By then they had loaded Big Joe into the hearse, and the rest of us got into the limousines and started up to Jackie Robinson Memorial Park. Jackie Robinson Memorial Park was a playground on one side, and on the other side there were benches and a few trees. We were going to pick out a spot in the park and have a ceremony, just like if there was really a grave. "I want to hear some dirt falling on the casket," Big Joe had said. Now, to me, this was going a little too far. I didn't think I could lie in no casket, even if it was cracked some so I could breathe and hear dirt tossed onto it. I was glad it wasn't in me in there. I might have split right then, but I knew the last part of the funeral was going to be okay. After the ceremony, we were all supposed to leave feeling good. Leroy's band would play some jazz, and the whole thing was going to turn into a party that would end up in Big Joe's place. When we were pulling up away from the funeral parlor, I saw Peaches and her girl taking down their signs. I figured they knew they had lost the fight. We were going to go over toward Malcolm X, but they were headed in the opposite direction in a big hurry. First, the cars went down to 141st Street, where Big Joe lived, and we went past his house real slow, showing respect to where he had spent his life. And then we turned up 145th Street and passed the restaurant real slow. Some brothers playing checkers on the corner took their hats off when we went by. Then we went up to the hill, to the park. Please answer questions 7 and 8. When we got there, the undertakers pulled out the coffin and put it on the roller and rolled it right into the grass. And that's when I saw Peaches and her crew again. They waited until we reached the place where Mr. Turner, the undertaker, had set up a little shade tent, and then they turned on the boombox they were carrying and blasted a song called "I'll Be Glad When You're Dead, You Rascal, You," all over the park. Peaches had the boombox right up close, and it was going as loud as she could get it going. Latoya was dancing, and people heard all the commotion and started gathering around. They were looking at each other and trying to figure out what was going on. There was this girl dancing to this old-time song and a funeral going on right in the middle of a park. Few winos drifted over to see if they could see a bunch of kids and stopped playing and gathered around. "Yo, brother, y'all gonna bury somebody here?" I had turned around and saw the short dude carrying a hot dog in one hand and a book in the other. He tilted his head down and looked over his glasses at me. "We're not really going to bury him," I whispered. "We're just going to throw some dirt on him before the party starts." The brother took a giant step back from me and shook his head. "You are crazy, right?" I just shrugged. Right about then, I thought the whole thing was going to come to a quick close because I saw 2 cops coming over. "What do you mean I gotta get a move on? You better get your hands off me." This is what Peaches and Squeezy were saying to the cops. "It's against the law to have your boom boxes turned up like that," one cop said. "You should have more respect for a funeral." Now I could see the cops eyeing us and looking at the coffin, and one of them talking to his radio. They weren't sure if they were doing was right, but they knew what to do about the loud boom box. So they took the box, and Peaches, Latoya, and Squeezy went after them. Leroy's band broke into "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot," and they lowered the coffin onto the ground and threw a couple of clumps of dirt onto it near the top so Big Joe could hear it. The funeral was officially over. The undertaker reached down and knocked on the wood to let Big Joe know. For a while nothing happened, and I held my breath. All eyes were glued to the coffin. But then it popped open, and Big Joe sat up. People who didn't know what was going on moved back in a big hurry, and one of the winos took off running. Big Joe got out of the coffin and shook everybody's hand. "Let the party begin," he said. Leroy's band broke into a reggae number, and we started bopping out the park. We piled back into the cars and headed on down to Big Joe's place with the horns going and people waving out the windows. When we reached Big Joe's, you could smell the food cooking. Big Joe's cousin Ernie was handing out sodas and started going to the restaurant. That's when we heard the sirens. Now, sirens on 145th Street are no big deal. They got dogs on the street that they've heard the sirens so many times they can imitate them perfectly. But when the police cars all pulled up in front of Big Joe's and the cops came out with their guns drawn, we knew something serious was going on. Please stop the recording here and finish the chapter on your own. Then answer the questions and wait for further directions.